What up, what up? What's good, y'all? This episode of the Becoming the Alpha Muslim podcast is sponsored by halalbedroom.com. Are you a married Muslim man? Has your bedroom game gotten a little stale? Are you looking to reignite the fires of passion? Maybe you're into the kinky stuff. Well, halalbedroom.com has what you need. With 35 different products ranging from massage oils to lubricants to erotic games to toys, I am sure you'll find something to suit your sexual desires. You know, I was looking through their catalog and they have this clitoral gel thing that is supposed to enhance orgasms. I'm pretty sure your wife would like some of that. The owner of halalbedroom.com is a Becoming the Alpha Muslim tribesman, and he contacted me personally to make an exclusive special offer to Becoming the Alpha Muslim listeners. For a limited time only, halalbedroom.com is offering a buy one get one free on your first order. If you want to get in on this offer and spice up your sex life, use this special URL. It's bit.ly/BTAM4HB. That's bit.ly/BTAM, the number 4, HB. One more time, bit.ly/BTAM4HB. Now, on with our episode. Assalamu alaikum, Runtings, Rude Boy, Nabil Aziz, BecomingTheAlphaMuslim.com, and the Becoming the Alpha Muslim podcast. Welcome to another episode, and today we're going to talk about how Muslim men can break into journalism, and I think it is quite important for there to be Muslim male voices in journalism, professional and journalism proper. Whether you want to do new media or traditional media, that doesn't really matter. And today I've got a guest with me who is has made quite a name for himself as a Muslim male journalist, at least to me, and at least in England. He's written for Buzzfeed, Vice, The Independent, The Guardian, New Statesman, Shortlist, Refinery 29, Mel Magazine, and next year he is going to be the UK Europe editor and staff writer for Mel Magazine. He's also the co-founder / co-host of No Country for Brown Men, a podcast, and he's also a co-host on the Trash Future podcast. I'd like to welcome my buddy Hussein Kesvani. Hussein, assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam. Thank you for having me on.
How are you doing today?
I'm good. It's I've taken a break from my day job at the moment, so I'm doing this in a public place. So that's always a bit weird, like, you know, when you're not in your room or in your studio or whatever.
Yeah, Hussein, I think your video is on. If you can turn it off, I think that might help the audio connection a little bit better.
One second. So how would I?
There's a bottom left.
Stop video.
Yeah.
Great. Okay.
Perfect. So I'll just tell the audience how Hussein and I sort of cross paths. As you know, most of the interesting people I meet, we met on Twitter, and he messaged me or DM'd me asking if he can interview me for a piece that he's writing for Mel Magazine, which is a men's magazine founded by the Dollar Shave Club guys. And he was writing a piece called The Small Growing World of Muslim MRAs. And as part of his research, he was interviewing me as the founder of Becoming the Alpha Muslim. And we had quite a long interview, which covered a number of different topics. And a lot of what I told him about the sort of purpose of Becoming the Alpha Muslim made it into the piece. But then, while writing, he threw shade at me. Instead of coming at me straight away and disagreeing with me outright, he editorialized his piece with ellipses and brackets and quotation marks around my words. You'll have to explain yourself, Hussein.
We can explain. So do you want to talk about that first? And then
let's talk about that and we can move on. Yeah.
Okay, so as I kind of said to you online, and I say this to some people who kind of, because this is actually a very frequent thing that happens in journalism, and it happens mainly because there is, I wouldn't necessarily a misunderstanding, but like the way that editing and publishing works is, it's not something that everyone knows. So when I submitted my piece to Mel, I had literally just copied and pasted your quotes. So we had spoken on email. All I did was put quotation marks because obviously those were your quotations, right? So I think in terms of how it was edited, when you send it to an editor, they'll kind of shape it. They'll take out stuff that maybe they feel doesn't kind of fit the narrative of the story. And as a journalist, you sometimes have disagreements, but also as someone who, so at that time I was a freelancer, and I don't really have a lot of time to kind of go back and forth with editors, especially because we both live in different countries. So when there sometimes comes a point where like editors kind of take it upon themselves to like edit things, and we get general agreements with reporters. I don't necessarily disagree with like how that piece was ultimately edited, but I think one thing that I've been thinking about a lot just in the course of my career as a reporter is where things that reporters don't kind of deem to be that important, or things that they feel kind of doesn't necessarily heed the overall value of the story, are in fact very important to the subject. And that is something that like as reporters and as an industry we have to sort of address, because sometimes that can get us into trouble. But the more important thing is actually that like, we, at least for me, like I want to build relationships with my sources and the people that I speak to. And my thing, since I started doing kind of this particular brand of like offbeat journalism, the thing that I wanted to make sure was that I wasn't going into any story like with any sort of prejudgments or any sort of expectations of how I wanted stories to change. So I think in terms of like throwing shade, it wasn't necessarily throwing shade. I think we have disagreements. That's fairly obvious, and we can talk about that. But I can say, like, hand on heart, that like whenever I approach stories, I try to tell them like with as little of my voice as possible.
Okay, so what you're explaining to me, what I understand is you didn't throw shade. Your cuck editor threw shade.
All the editors at Mel are great, and they're very, very smart people. So I'm not going to call them cucks.
No, I would never ask you to do that. I think Mel has a very interesting sort of positioning in that the magazine itself is really quite. I'm not something I would personally call a magazine that is, pro men or devoted to male masculinity and things like that. It's more, I guess, like a sort of like a male feminist where, okay, come as you are, whether you identify as Zimzir, it's all good. You're all sort of men, and we'll all talk about it, which I suppose is fine. You need stuff like that just for men to have a space to talk. So in your case, it wasn't such a big deal. It was just that one little tiny bit. And I think as writers and even as a copywriter, something I have to balance with my clients is how much of their revisions can I incorporate into my own copy without ruining the selling of that this sort of sellability or strength of that copy. And then you have to pick your battles, I suppose.
Yeah, I think like as anyone, sorry about the background noise.
That's okay.
As someone who does writing, whether you're like a journalist or a copywriter, you're the one in control of the story, right? So you're dealing with like either lots of voices or you're managing one voice. And I think that's a very different experience from like when you're interviewing someone or when you're talking to a client, right? And I think a lot of the time as writers, like we sometimes forget that, don't we? I've published stories before where I've managed 6 or 7 voices in terms of trying to tell the story. And you've had like sources come back who have been like, how come you only used one quote of mine rather than like this big thing? It doesn't put my quote into context, or it doesn't kind of say exactly what I want to say. And that's happened on like really small stories, not just on like Muslim stuff, but just like I used to work in like business press, right? covering kind of small and medium news agents, convenience stores and stuff. And I remember like one time I got a call from like this news agent who kind of said, you know, I was expecting to have this like whole feature about me. Why have I only been featured once in this article? And it's like, well, it wasn't about you. It was about like, you know, this new distribution system. So yeah, I think whatever type of journalism that you do, or whatever type of writing that you do, that sort of kind of separation is always going to be there.
Yeah, and I think what I did in response was, and I think you mentioned this in your interview with what's her name, Nice Mangoes on the
yes,
the whatever something conversations podcast.
Yeah,
you told her I wrote a riposte. I didn't write a riposte. I just published our entire conversation in full, so people would actually, you know, get the context, which I think is fair. I didn't change anything. I did write an introduction because there was one aspect about your piece that I disagreed with, in the sense that it seemed like you didn't have enough time to fully research the different sub-sects, to put it in a religious sense, of the manosphere, or the sort of different male spaces that are online. And so I just wanted to, you know, add a little bit of color to that. Yeah, but otherwise your piece was it was quite fair, if I could say.
Okay, well, thank you. I appreciate that.
And you've also written a very interesting piece on masturbating while Muslim, where you talk to members of Muslim NoFap.
Yeah,
and sort of one thing I noticed about your pieces is that this makes total sense to people from our background who have the spiritual or religious context to understand it. But like the discussion with Nice Mangoes, her name is Aina, right?
Yes, yeah.
Like the discussion with Nice Mangoes, like she just couldn't get it, why Muslims would sort of view masturbation and looking at pornography in this fashion. And I sort of got the sense that you also were like, yo, what's up with these guys?
I don't know. So I wouldn't necessarily say either was true. Like, I'll let kind of Aina like speak for her. I'll let Aina speak for herself.
Yeah.
I don't like necessarily kind of assume where she's from, but I wouldn't necessarily like assume that she's coming from like a point of like complete ignorance. Like, she did grow up in like a Muslim, you know, she grew up in like she grew up in like Saudi Arabia, right? Mm-hmm. So not Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, I think.
Yeah.
You'll have to correct me like if she hears this. I think with me it was sort of, so I grew up in like a religious Muslim family, right?
Yeah.
So all these things I was writing about, the idea had come like a couple of years ago when I was just thinking about this as like a general topic, right? So the big thing was really, I was covering Muslim news for Buzzfeed, and one thing I was really interested in was like the changing curriculum around like, you know, sex education around here, right? And I was kind of thinking, well, okay, how does this apply to schools in East London, which are state government schools, but the majority of pupils there are Muslim pupils, and their parents will have like a different relationship with their teachers, or like different, you know, perspectives of how they would want to teach their kids about this stuff than say the school that I went to, which was like a mixed suburban, mixed suburban school, where we pretty much stuck to the standard curriculum. I think the thing that you tap into is sort of like, it's more about translation, right? So if I was writing this for a Muslim newspaper or a Muslim TV station, I used to work for like a Muslim TV station in London a couple of years ago, the package would have been very different, because you assume the audience that you talk to already know the prior stuff. When you're working for like a secular Western publication, especially one where like we're talking about, say, British issues or European issues to Americans, a lot of the stuff, it seems to be, seems aloof, or reads to be aloof, are just really things that like you need to explain beforehand in order for like stuff to make sense. So I think like to answer part of your question anyway, I don't think it was me necessarily being surprised that, oh, why can't these people do it? Do the thing that they want to do. It was more to do. I was more fascinated with like the interaction of the internet and what role internet community sort of played in this discussion. Because when I was younger, and we had these conversations, they would really just be like in playgrounds. They'd be in football fields. When MSN Messenger was around, they would be like on private messages and stuff. There was nothing like the infrastructure that we have at the moment. So I was more fascinated with the idea of like, Facebook Live workshops around this subject than the actual subject itself.
Yeah, I think you did a good job conveying that in the piece. I know you mentioned several Islamic scholars who were speaking about the subject openly on on Facebook Live and things like that. So it came across quite well. Now we're just gonna move on to sort of what you think about new media and the prominence of crowdfunded journalism. But before that, I just wanted to mention or just ask you about the fact that you have all of these bylines, and those are quite impressive. Although I don't think that you got paid very much for all of these, if I'm assuming correctly. So it's not as impressive as it sounds, even though all these names would look good on a website. But you don't have your own website. You don't have even an About Me page. You've got a LinkedIn.
Sure.
Can a journalist in this day and age sort of make a name for himself and survive if he doesn't have his own platform? Because this is something that pardon me for interrupting you, because this is something that you guys talk a lot about in No Country for Brown Men as well, about representation in the media and things like that. But what I see is that you are expecting the colonial masters to give you their table scraps when you have the power and the resources to create your own platforms and create your own stories, like you do with your podcast.
Sure. Okay, so like to start off with the website stuff, I am going to be launching one next year. The reason why I didn't really do one for so long was partially because I was trying to code it myself, and trying to code from scratch. Like you can build a very basic build fairly easily, but when you try to add on all like the funky extras, using like your Rails, your Rails writing and stuff, and it all messes up. It's very demotivating. So it's sticking, it's stuck in like an HTML file at the moment.
Yeah.
But what I'm planning to do early next year is to kind of launch like my own personal website, and that'll kind of have packages to like all the stuff that I've done. In terms of the broader question, I think, so No Country for Brown Men was a weird one because both me and my friend who do it, Rohan Banerjee, like we were doing it while we were both like established journalists, right? So he works at like one of the UK's like oldest left-wing magazines, the New Statesman. Before starting the podcast, like I was a staff writer at Buzzfeed, where I was actually paid like quite well. And I had like done work for Vice, I had done work for The Guardian. I was freelancing around. So I was like, I would imagine like pretty successful for like a starter journalist, right? I had like more jobs than, I know people who I graduated with in 2013 who decided to become journalists, and they're still like freelancing and doing these things called shifts where they work in newspaper offices doing night shifts, and not really being paid a lot to kind of to screw up their sleep races. So it wasn't necessarily coming from the point of like, oh, we're both really unsuccessful and we're doing this to try to get jobs. The reason why we had started the podcast was I think we were looking at this broader conversation about like, why are so many kind of ethnic minority, like BAME kids, especially like Asian kids, like, direct messaging us on Twitter asking whether we can get them internships when we don't really have the power to do that. And it brought up the bigger question of like, okay, if you're a BAME person who's just graduated from university and you really want to get into journalism, but you're entering a media world where like things are changing really fast and no one really knows what's going on, right? I think if you ask media people, at least in the UK, like what's the landscape looking like in the next 5 years, no one will really have a straight answer, because on the one hand, newspaper revenues are falling, TV followings are falling, digital media revenues are increasing, but the reason they're increasing is largely because of like this pivot to video format. And when you move towards when these big established organizations are moving towards multimedia based strategies, they're firing lots of people in the process, right? So it's this very weird climate where like there is money to be made, and I think there will continue to be money to be made. So, as technology kind of increases and gets better and more mobile, but that doesn't necessarily come with jobs. It's kind of like the automation argument, right? Journalism was like one of the first industries to kind of see automation like happen on a really big scale. So I guess we were talking about that, and we were talking about, okay, what if you're like an ethnic minority person, how do you go about doing that now? It was more of a question than anything else.
Right, exactly. And that makes sense, obviously. And I'm aware that while you guys are doing the podcast, you were, working journalists, and besides the jokes about the two of you being failures in the eyes of your family, and honoring your ancestors, which I find very entertaining. It's a running theme. The podcast in general is excellent, and I recommend everybody listen to it. We're waiting for the next episodes.
I'm trying to get the rest out by the end of the year.
Yeah.
So I'm aiming for like a week before Christmas, just like launch 4 or 5 of them.
Yeah. You wrote this piece earlier this year called "Why Patreon Won't Save Journalism," and it's an interesting piece. I'm interested in why you sort of argue this, because we saw yesterday Mike Cernovich, fully independent national security expert, break one of the biggest stories of the year, something that you might not achieve in your entire career, and he's fully independent, funded by Patreon and funded by his readers, and he maintains his independence. His reporting is not colored by the fact that he is accountable to his readers.
Come on. No, that's like, okay. So, so we're going to like fundamentally disagree on Mike Cernovich.
Yeah. Before we do that, can I just ask, because I know we agree on quite a lot of issues, and we disagree fundamentally on quite a lot of issues. So where on the spectrum of quote unquote Muslimness do you fall from, brown person with a Muslim name to ISIS?
Yeah. Oh, that's a big one. That's an interesting one, because I think it means different stuff in different countries, doesn't it? From my experience, anyway. So I don't know how many of your listeners or you are kind of familiar with British things, but I would I would set myself like firmly in the middle, in the sense of like, I think some people would still describe me as like a practicing Muslim, in the sense of like, I don't drink, I don't eat pork, I don't do drugs and stuff like that. But then at the same time, like, I also don't have like a beard as thick as yours, or
you have a nice beard though. You have a strong beard.
Well, it's it's getting there. It's getting there. Like I don't always go to Jummah prayers. So, and I think it fluctuates like from period to period. I was like a very staunch atheist when I was in university, and it took me a while to kind of get to a point to be like more comfortable with like Islamic identity, and it's still something that like I'm sort of searching as well. So I'm going to say quite in the middle ground at the moment, but that could obviously change. It could go either way. You never know. Okay, so back onto the Patreon stuff.
Yes.
So I can't really remember what I said in fact, because I remember writing it very quickly. And I think the reason I was really looking at people like Tim Pool, Lawrence Southern, lots of these other kind of like right wing, like So like people who were sort of relying. I mean, Pool doesn't, as far as I know, like rely on Patreon because he is employed by Infowars. So I was looking at this model of like, okay, what happens if you're like, say, a YouTube personality who's decided to get into quote unquote journalism, and you decided to do it on your own, and the way that you do it is through Patreon. And this was also during a time when I think like Patreon had, or just after it, kind of went for a bit of a controversy because it had shut down a couple of accounts. I think they had shut down like Lawrence Southern's account or something. So I think the argument I was kind of saying.
Your piece is long before they shut down, before the controversy.
Oh, was it? Okay.
Yeah.
See, I can't even remember.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So I think the thing that I was thinking about was how news structures and news organizations worked. So one of my first jobs when I got out of university in 2013 was at a startup media company called Clip It, and they were one of the first apps to try do news via podcasts. So the idea would be, and I was like a technology officer, so I was doing like a bunch of coding, a bunch of development for them. And the idea was that every morning you would receive 5 stories to your phone every day, and those 5 stories would be curated by an in-house team of freelancers. And the money to fund that organization was largely through crowdfunding. Not in the formal sense, in the sense of like Patreon and like stuff like that didn't exist, but it was through Facebook. So the guy who started it was just like, I want to start a media company to hold other media companies accountable, and to change the face of journalism, to tell the truth. And because he had like quite a big profile, like he had racked up a lot of money. Within like a year and a half, that company shut down. And I'd left before then, but it was one of those things where like you had people who had this idea, they had this vision, which was noble, but when you put money in their hands, they didn't really know how to execute it. And there was always this fear of like, okay, what is the balance between like journalistic integrity in terms of like telling stories, in terms of curating stories, also the technical stuff too, in terms of, how much capacity do we have to kind of tell stories? What is the responsibility to our existing audience, but how do we also grow another audience? How do we make sure that we don't get crowded out of the market? All those technical stuff that like when you start with this idea of like, I want to really change the face of journalism, you don't really tend to think about very much. So my experience of crowdsourcing started from there. Now, obviously that was like within a company structure. And I guess the way we talk about Patreon now is like individuals who kind of get crowdfunding to go do stories or to go like, tell certain things. But with that also like the definition of sort of journalism has changed as well, right? I think that's like a big cultural change too. How people define what journalism is, if you ask like different groups of people, you'll get different answers. So, for example, if I went to like the British Muslim community who I used to report about and say, okay, if we were to start like a Muslim media organization, what would we define as like news and journalism? They would say, okay, well, we want lots of stories about Prevent, and we want lots of stories about, and Prevent is like the counter-terrorism program, counter-extremism program in the UK. And okay, that's fine. If you want to invest all your money into that, into doing Prevent stuff, then there is like a public good that comes with that. But the sacrifice, the thing that you give up, and there's an economics word for it, and I can't remember what it is. Something to do with like Pareto cost. But the cost of like
opportunity cost.
Yes, that's it. There you go. Thank you. The cost of like putting loads of your resources into Prevent stuff, and that's a really time-inducing process, is that you don't talk about like things within Muslim communities. So things like the stuff that I've done at Mel, for example, or you don't talk about like, one of the big kind of underlining issues in like British Muslim conversations is about Muslim charities and like how efficiently they use their money, So when you're dealing with like that level of money and your accountability is largely to groups and communities, then you're automatically sacrificing something in order to pursue something else. You're like single issue, whether you're a single issue reporter or whether you're like doing single issue journalism. I think there is a utility to that, but there is also a cost of kind of calling that enterprise journalism rather than say activism. And when I kind of think about the people who call themselves journalists, and maybe Mike Cernovich like falls into this too. I don't know. He's blocked me online, so like I don't really know like what he gets up to, but I would kind of see him more as an activist than anything else. Obviously, like those lines are blurred on both sides of the spectrum, on the left and the right. But the more those lines blur, I think the less clear of an idea we have of what this kind of new vision of journalism is supposed to look like.
Yeah, I think that's. I think one of the reasons is because people like you, people like Roshan Saleh, come from this sort of purist journalism background, and that sort of infrastructure or structure or methodology of journalism, it doesn't exist anymore. people are gonna go out and do citizen journalism, whether whether these organizations like it or not.
I don't think that's necessarily true. I think that the balance has sort of changed. I think that like citizen journalists can kind of go get. So think about, there's a guy called Tim Pool who you probably know about. He kind of rolls. So back in 2013, 14, he was considered to kind of be like one of the pioneer citizen journalists, right?
Yeah.
So one of his big things is that he went to Egypt and he like brought a load of live streaming software with him, and he basically ran around Tahrir Square and these other places where the Arab Spring was happening, or like where these civil wars were happening, and he would just live stream, right? So he was deemed as a citizen journalist. Now, if you think about that now, if you think about someone who did that now, and I guess like, I don't know, like Baked Alaska sort of does that as well, right? These like 1 hour, 2 hour live streams.
Yes.
You sort of got a question that, okay, you're distributing information, right? So that makes you one kind of journalist, but you're distributing so much information that the ultimate value of how much you're giving out is sort of questionable, right? The only people, like, I don't know if people like watch the whole 2 hour live streams unless they're kind of followers of, Baked Alaska or Tim Pool or something like that. I don't see where like the journalistic value of that comes from. Whereas I think even if you look at like Mike Cernovich's scoop from this week, and like I'll admit, like, it was, I'm not going to say that, oh, it was really bad journalism. Like, it's really important journalism. And as someone on the left, like, to expose people on both sides when it comes to kind of wrongdoing is really important. But obviously, like, that information was given to BuzzFeed, and BuzzFeed found out more context around that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's where like the traditional stuff comes from, because when you're at BuzzFeed, like, the way that BuzzFeed News operates is still very much like old school journalism. They still kind of take people out of like Columbia and like Princeton journalism schools, in the UK like City journalism or like any of the other established journalism colleges, to go do the contextual research. One of the most important things, and one of the things that I don't know if I highlighted in the Medium piece, but it's still really important when we talk about citizen journalism, is also like this recognition of like the issues surrounding media law and media ethics. So when I was in journalism school, like half of my time was spent like, reading up on like ethics and like the issues around libel law and, copyright infringement and all these like other issues. And in the UK is a very litigious country. So you could almost get sued for anything. But in the US, that's really important too. And one thing I sort of think about is, well, okay, these Patreon guys are really good at going into public settings and just like throwing their cameras around. And you're legally allowed to do that. No one can really stop them. It's fairly low risk to do that, unless any of these guys are like getting involved in violence or inciting violence on camera. They're largely fine. But what happens if they decide to kind of, try find a senator who's done something wrong, or try to find like a politician who's like done wrongdoing, and they have to go through like documents and archives and mounds and mounds of research and do tons and tons of FOI requests. I haven't seen any of these like crowdfunded Patreon journalists do anything by way of like FOIs, right? Most of their work is basically traveling around with cameras and staying in hotels and talking about what they've seen and what they think about stuff. And I think there's like a fundamental difference there, right? So I'm not kind of discounting, I'm not saying that it's not journalism at all, but I'm also rejecting the idea that like it's the future model and that we should discard like old ways of doing things because they don't yield anything. Bear in mind that like, BuzzFeed News has got like a ton of scoops, stuff that these Patreon guys like have to eventually follow up. They share it if they agree with it, or they react when the Milo story that my friend Joe Bernstein did.
Yes.
Right. That was huge. That was absolutely massive. And it forced all these guys who called themselves real journalists to like react to it in some way, right? So we know that it's still reactive. We know that it's still provocative. And Joe isn't a Joe isn't like a crowdfunded journalist. He's a shoe leather reporter who trained in a very classical way, who works at an organization which does journalism the old way. Mm-hmm. So I think that's kind of where I am. Sorry if I like went on a bit, but
no, that's very, very. It was very, very valuable. Like, okay, so my thing is that kind of reporting that Joe did, and in fact, I was quite impressed when I read that piece on, Milo. Those pieces are few and far between. What I see coming out from these web media outlets is extremely politicized, extremely editorialized, left-leaning stuff. So if that's the case, and there aren't any opportunities for people who want to tell stories with a different perspective, and these people are not given the platform, isn't it obvious that they're going to resort to other means to get the news that they want to hear? Because ultimately, it's the audience that decides what is important or not. What do you think?
I don't think it's necessarily the audience that chooses, because I think, I don't know, from a foreigner's view looking towards the US, but I'm sure this happens in the Middle East a lot. It definitely happens in India.
Yes.
Which is that critical journalism of power is going to exist regardless of whether people like it or not, right?
Mm-hmm.
There have been, as you said, there have been endless kind of articles, denouncing Donald Trump and what he's done, despite the fact that he still has a really, really solid support base, and despite the fact that we don't know what CNN is going to look like, now that the AT&T merger is being blocked. That type of journalism is still going to exist, and a part of it, a part of this content direction is largely dependent on markets. The Huffington Post wouldn't exist if there wasn't a market for the Huffington Post.
Mm-hmm.
The magazine I'm going to be working for, Mel, wouldn't exist if they didn't think that there was a market for a certain type of man. That's just what happens when news journalism goes into the private sphere, right? I think in that sense, it's really good to look at state broadcasters. So obviously we have the BBC, the state, the largely state-funded broadcaster, and BBC News, whose mission is okay, how do we tell stories that give us accountability to the public? It's one where, so the BBC is always routinely kind of criticized for either being too left-wing or too right-wing. And lots of people who work at BBC kind of say, this is great because if we've angered everyone, then it means we're doing the right job. And I think that's a little bit of a simplistic way of looking at things, but there is a certain value to it, right? Which is they constantly have to grapple with this question of how do we kind of report things as neutrally as possible in order to be accountable to the public. That's not going to be the case if you work for a magazine. That's not going to be the case if you work for a website. And websites, these websites aren't. One of the things that I really find funny is people on both sides who kind of post articles saying that, when did The Atlantic become a right-wing rag, or when did the New York Times become a communist newspaper or something like that. Or one of the funniest things is that New York Times is Brett Stevens is a columnist, and every time he puts out an article kind of saying that maybe climate change isn't as dangerous as it seems, you'll have hordes of left-wing environmentalists saying why is the New York Times posting this sort of garbage?
Yeah.
The thing about these papers is that I don't think, maybe the NYT is different, but things like the Huffington Post, Buzzfeed, they've never kind of said we're neutral outlets, right? They do stuff. There is a type of reader that reads those things, and I know for the Huffington Post, I was listening to a podcast with Lydia Pullman, who's the new editor, and she was sort of saying that look, we're going to be on the side of progress, right? So wherever progress is, we're going to follow up with stories or features and stuff like that. They never kind of said that we're going to be a neutral organization that doesn't take sides.
Yeah.
So, and maybe and I think that's more indicative of how the internet is changing more than anything else, and how we view markets online, right? How we kind of view what demographics read what, or what demographics watch what. And that's not just with news organizations, that's with companies like Netflix, that's with, e-commerce organizations, that's with everyone, right? The way that the internet has been structured and the types of how you define people, everything has sort of become politicized. So I think it's only natural that you're going to have that sort of structure. And it's from that structure where you'll inevitably have people who kind of say, okay, nothing online represents me, so I'm going to go my own way.
Okay, so now that we've sort of laid out where journalism is right now in the current year and where it's going, what are your recommendations for Muslim men who would like to enter into journalism? Where should they start? Should they go the traditional way? Should they just, open up a Patreon and start posting on Twitter?
So I'm cautious about kind of saying you should start the traditional way, largely because sometimes that involves having to take up unpaid internships, which I morally disagree with, or spending like a ton of money going to like journalism school, money that like they may not have, or like they have to borrow from their parents or something. I know where that kind of feeling comes from. So my thing is that if you can get like paid internships at like established magazines, then definitely go take them, and don't kind of just think about the big news things that you see on your on the convenience store racks and stuff. Like, think about business publications, think about small publications, think about small websites, anything that will let you write. I think the key thing about working in journalism is like you've got to know how to tell stories regardless of what thing you go from. I before kind of moving to Mel, like I've been doing comms at a charity. I never expected to kind of do that, like copywriting, copy editing, stuff like that. I wish I'd done that a lot earlier, because it's taught me how to be a much better writer. Because at the end of the day, like when you're in jobs like doing copy or advertising or, those types of management jobs where you've got to communicate stories, like you've always got to think about, it's a really good exercise to discard what you think the story is and think about, okay, what is my audience thinking? What am I trying to tell, like someone who knows nothing about the subject? How do I remove myself from this as much as possible? So anything that lets you write, and anything that like lets you write a lot, is really, really beneficial. I would say, like, to get into journalism in particular, to have a think about like what stories you can currently tell at the moment. So, are they stories about your community? Are they stories about, one of my big bits of advice to people is like, try not to do opinion pieces, because everyone online has an opinion, right? And no one's going to pay for you to write your opinion if they can get it for free on Twitter or something. So have a story in mind. And I started out doing features. So one of my first articles when I started was an interview with a human rights, with like one of the former kind of human rights directors at the UN, who was based in Australia. It was the first like news piece I did. And it was really, really tough. It took me like 2 weeks to write it. But it was really important because it was the first time that I'd written something where I didn't start off with like, I think this or that. It was just like, okay, I'm going to tell the story of this guy and like his amazing story. And I sort of realized that, okay, this is a different skill set, but it's one that's way more beneficial. Because at the end of the day, like, anyone can tell you their opinions, anyone can tell their stuff. But if you can tell like a really good story that someone will read from beginning to end, that's super valuable. And by the time you kind of even get a rudimentary understanding of that, you'll be way better than like so many writers that are online and like way more primed for jobs. So that's the main thing, like build up your portfolio, meet as many people as you can, use Twitter, use Facebook to kind of network with people, get advice from them, build up your networks, and just tell stories. Like, you don't have to go to journalism school. You don't have to like do unpaid internships. Be in a position where like you've got enough stuff where you can sell it to like news organizations. Have you seen a film called Nightcrawler?
No, I have not.
So it's with Jake Gyllenhaal. Like, it's a very weird and surreal story. I wouldn't say be like the character that Jake Gyllenhaal plays, but one of the interesting, it's a story about a guy who like starts from nothing, just like buys a video camera from like a cheap secondhand store, and he builds up like a video production house. And he does it just by kind of getting the stories and selling them, and just going out every night and getting stories until the point where he becomes really, really, really good at it. So it's definitely worth watching that. Not kind of, and obviously don't become sadistic, but I think it's a really good example of kind of how you can make a name for yourself without kind of compromising anything by way of like finance or morals.
Are there any books that you can recommend people read to get started? I know maybe Roshan Saleh's book is one that Muslim men might want to read.
Yeah, so I think that's like the most specific Muslim journalism book that I can find. There's lots of books from like Muslim women who are like war reporters. I can't really think of like many from like Muslim men. The book that really helped me out when I was like wanting to become a reporter wasn't actually by a Muslim man, but it was by Seymour Hersh, the biography of Seymour Hersh. So he's like this old school, leather shoe reporter.
Yeah.
And it just charts his story from like when he was like a failing undergraduate at the University of Chicago up to the point where like he basically uncovered like all the US wrongdoing in Vietnam, and he did it all like on his own, just by like sneaking into buildings and like using pay phones and stuff like that. It's this like really mad story, the one that's like really, really inspiring, just as like really quality writing.
Yeah. And I think if I was to add my own 2 cents, the first thing I would tell them to do is own your own name, have a website, which Hussein has failed to do because for some reason he thinks he needs to code the entire website himself. We're going to talk about this when we're on Twitter when we're done. You don't need to code the entire website yourself. You can buy a really good-looking premium quality theme and get set up and running for under $150. So you need to own your own website, and you need to, like Hussein said, you need to write, okay? You need to publish stories, and the easiest way for people to know that you can be a journalist is if you already have stories published on your own website and you're already doing reporting of some kind. So that's one area where I see a lot of aspiring journalists that they need to capitalize on, because there are no barriers to entry anymore. It's all about you and how much work you're willing to put in to achieve this goal of being a journalist. What are you working on right now, Hussein?
I'm taking a break at the moment, so I'm not back until January.
Yeah.
But I've been working on an investigation at the moment. I'm not going to say too much about it, largely because like it's fairly wild. But and I actually don't even know if it's true. But if it does prove to be true, it'll be a very fun story.
And I believe you're working on a book as well?
Yes. I'm trying to finish that at the moment as well. And that book is about British Muslim identity online, of which the Mel piece will sort of be part of that.
Yeah, I expect to be featured heavily in the book. All right, Hussein. I think we covered almost everything I wanted to cover. Is there anything further you'd like to add? Any advice that you'd like to give to the Akis?
No, not at the moment. Largely because I've got to go back to my office. But if you put my Twitter handle when you share this thing out, I'm more than happy to kind of give advice on DMs or email or whatever.
I will do that. Excellent. All right, Jazakumullah khair, Hussein, for coming on and giving us your experience and wisdom. Really appreciate it.
No worries. Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much. Appreciate everybody listening in. If you did enjoy this content, please consider subscribing to Becoming the Alpha Muslim on iTunes and leaving a rating and review. Jazakumullah khair. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. What up? What's good, y'all? This episode of the Becoming the Alpha Muslim podcast is sponsored by halalbedroom.com. Are you a married Muslim man? Has your bedroom game gotten a little stale? Are you looking to reignite the fires of passion? Maybe you're into the kinky stuff. Well, halalbedroom.com has what you need. With 35 different products ranging from massage oils to lubricants to erotic games to toys, I am sure you'll find something to suit your sexual desires. You know, I was looking through their catalog and they have this clitoral gel thing that is supposed to enhance orgasms. I'm pretty sure your wife would like some of that. The owner of halalbedroom.com is a Becoming the Alpha Muslim tribesman, and he contacted me personally to make an exclusive special offer to Becoming the Alpha Muslim listeners. For a limited time only, halalbedroom.com is offering a buy one get one free on your first order. If you want to get in on this offer and spice up your sex life, use this special URL. It's bit.ly/BTAM4HB. That's bit.ly/BTAM, the number 4, HB. One more time, bit.ly/BTAM4HB. Now, on with our episode.